Welcome back. Afrotellers is an event dedicated to celebrating and advancing African storytelling as an art form that transcends geographical, cultural and ideological boundaries. This conference brings together storytellers, artists, scholars and community leaders from across the continent and the diaspora, fostering an enriching dialogue about African narratives. Under its 2024 theme, Beyond Borders, Mapping New Frontiers for African Storytelling, Afrotellers invites participants to explore the multifaceted dimensions of storytelling that reflects the diverse experiences and the histories of African people. Conference lead Willson Chivanga joined us now for more. Willson, a very good morning. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I'm quite enchanted by this year's theme, which is Beyond Borders, Mapping New Frontiers for African Storytelling. Yeah. What inspires the theme?
So I think it really comes from an ongoing conversation really that's been happening around how do we collaborate as storytellers beyond the geographical borders that were imposed on us? But then what role do storytellers play in actually bringing us to a point as a people, as Africans, to understand that, yes, we might have these geographical borders, but there is more that unites us as a people. And for us, really, it's around thinking through what is the African story and how can we tell this African story from South Africa, from Uganda, from Botswana, wherever it is, right? So for us, really, it's around thinking through how do we create a space, how do we create and, build a movement of African storytellers who can actually collaborate beyond these borders and really begin to push, the African narrative together. I mean, I always give an example and I say, when you go to the US, you hear everyone talking about the American dream, right?
Of course.
But think about Africa and say, so what is the African story? What is the African dream? So I think that is where we are driving it to say we have Agenda 2063, for example, which is supposed to be this grand vision for Africa, the African dream, right? So how do we then begin to craft a narrative and a story, an African story that speaks to that big agenda, that big dream, which then inspires confidence in African people to say, this is the African dream. This is what we are building and working towards as a people.
So in what format or in what art form will such stories be told? I
mean, across all diversity. So, from visual storytelling, music, journalism in media, right? But also in academia. What are we teaching, students? It also goes back even, we had a wonderful workshop yesterday with one of the lecturers at WITS, who is a choreographer, Smangaliso Ngwenya. And he was teaching us around the stories we tell with our body movements. So storytelling is not just about what we are vocalizing or the pictures and the images. It's how our bodies move. It's the confidence we exude as a people, right? So for us, it's really around thinking through all these ways and even digital media as well, right? Everyone now is a storyteller with your cell phone. But what story are we telling about the continent? So for us, it's really around getting people to this place where we understand the need for us to tell a different African story. You go on your social media and what you're going to see is this narrative around Africa being a broken continent, right?
Sure.
So that's what we talk about, but that's not the African story. There is more to our story than that. And so when I go on my social media, it means I'm intentional about actually, telling a different story about Africa. So I choose to celebrate Africa. I choose to celebrate all the beautiful things about this continent. So for us, that is now building this community, this movement of, changing the narrative around African storytelling.
And what's so fascinating about storytelling is that it doesn't necessarily have to be verbal.
Absolutely.
You can tell a story by what you do. You can tell a story by how you dress.
Exactly.
Because the dress code can't tell a particular story.
It does.
So having said that, how do you then envision the role of storytelling transcending cultural and ideological boundaries, at least in the African context?
So we had James Ngobo yesterday, and he's such a legendary figure in the African storytelling scene as a producer. And he said something so powerful, which I've been reflecting on since yesterday. And he said, telling stories beyond borders is already happening. And he was referencing how amazing producers are, producing brilliant, performances across the world, in London, in New York. He was just coming from London and he was telling us about this community of Nigerian storytellers who have literally taken, London by storm. And his point was, African storytellers are already doing this in a way. And we're already now painting a new picture of Africa. And he's saying he's seeing a big shift in, you know, the stories we tell, because like I just mentioned earlier, I think the predominant narrative is that it's been that of pain, of strife, of hunger, of disease.
Yeah.
But then now I think there is a group of people who are rising up and saying, no, 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 no. That's not our story, because our story is not a single story. And you see that shift now with people really now beginning to celebrate Africa, celebrating our diversity, celebrating our food, you know, celebrating our languages as well. So we're already seeing that. And when storytellers begin to do that, what it does to the human psyche is it begins to, you know, bring us to a place where we can unlearn all those things that we were taught, because much of what we're struggling with right now is remnants of colonialism. It's South Africa apartheid, right? So when storytellers begin to tell these different stories and begin to instill a sense of confidence in our identity as a people, we begin to see ourselves differently. And that's what we're aiming for. When we begin to see ourselves differently, then we can be able to start telling a different story about ourselves.
And since this conference is all about telling stories, you know, telling different African stories from different African countries, since the conference started on Thursday and you've heard so many different stories, so what's the common thread in those stories? Do you think or do you get a sense that those stories are truly reflective of the African story?
No, definitely. I mean, we had about 8 different African countries represented in the conference, and it's been interesting to see how, even though our realities, you know, we're in different geographical contexts, but our stories, they shared, you know, realities. So the African story is shared, you know, across all the different countries. And I think the conversations we have had, you know, themes that have really come out really well are around who is actually shaping the narrative around this African story. And I think a lot of it is our story has been told by others other than ourselves. Yeah. So I think that's been a recurring theme, to say we need to take ownership of this story, and we need to be bold enough to challenge, you know, even those stereotypes that are being perpetuated, right? And be able to stand up and say no. And I think another theme that really comes up is around financing of our stories.
Okay.
Who is funding our stories? You think of Hollywood, right? You have Wall Street funding, you know, Hollywood. So who is funding African stories? Because if we don't address that issue at scale around funding African stories, funding the film sector, funding, you know, visual artists to produce work which is authentic, we then create a situation whereby our narratives are shaped by, you know, the global north that is going to give us money to tell these stories. Oh, yes. So now it has to suit the narrative that they want. So it's time for us to actually have a serious conversation as African people, African governments. How are we telling this story? Because if you look at the US government funds a lot of, you know, American stories. All right. Willson, great chatting to you, man. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And all the best for the last day today, hey? Thank you so much. Thank you. That was Afroteller Conference lead Willson Chivanga talking to us about Afrotellers, which kickstarted on Thursday and will end today.